Hello and welcome to another edition of Legislative Update here on Okemo Valley TV. My name is Tom Ayres, Senior Staff Writer for the Vermont Standard newspaper in Woodstock. And my guest this week, as always, is Vermont State Representative Charlie Kimbell from Woodstock, representing Plymouth, Reading, and Woodstock in the State House. Good day, Charlie. How are you?
Hi, Tom. Thanks for having me again. Glad to
You
be here.
bet. You bet. What we'd like to do this week is provide an overview for our viewers of what is sure to be the central issue and central focus of the legislature this session, and that is education financing reform. We've talked about it in the past. We'll be talking about it significantly in the weeks ahead, really drilling into the details and the specifics. But for today's program, I'd like to uh, go over what the process is that the discussions of educational finance reform will be as it moves through the House and Senate. Can you sketch that out a little bit?
Sure. It is the dominant issue in the legislature this session, and we have to first consider what preceded this session, and that was the creation of this Commission on the Future of Public Education in Vermont. And they're charged with a really large challenge to come up with what does education look like in the future for Vermont, and that this commission was established to come up with a recommendations for by December of 2025, this coming December. And in the interim, they were encouraged to come up with cost containment measures in December of 2024 to recommend to the legislature. And then they basically said, you know what, we can't do that. Here's a bunch of things that you could consider, but in order to really affect costs, you have to affect governance and you have to affect delivery, meaning how many school districts are there, how many supervisory unions are there, and how many schools are there. So those are a lot of things that the commission didn't have time to do. So they said, we can't do anything this year. So then the administration, who had been really doing a deep dive into all the different aspects of education, unloaded this incredibly comprehensive proposal for transforming public education in the state. And that has dramatic things. I think we talked about it last week with, going down to 5 school districts from 119 and eliminating the construct of supervisory unions. And then also on education funding of changing from the current system to what's called a foundation formula. And so this involves every committee in the House and Senate. Um,
Wow.
it's a huge proposal. I had a school board member ask me, "Can the governor do this by executive order?" And I was like, "No, this is something that the legislature has to really struggle with, just from an aspect of how do you create, 5 school districts. That's what the governor recommended. Why 5? Not really sure, but it was an existing geographic map as to how the superintendents kind of get together and have really professional association as to how they look at how do you run your school, that kind of stuff,
Mhm.
and also overlays the community action agencies and where their territories are, like SEVCA, Southeast Vermont Community Action Group, has from Norwich all the way down to Brattleboro type of stuff. So
Mhm.
there's some overlay in those districts, but just to do that would be huge. You remember Act 46
Mhm.
and how painful that was for school districts to merge. We've already had, an example of this in the past. That was incredibly disruptive and painful in order to get to that point. But that was the state saying, okay, districts, we're going to leave it up to you to figure out. This is different. This is the state saying, okay, here's our proposal. We're going to go to 5 districts. So that's a big difference with this.
Mhm.
Funding piece is also very different. Right now, it's up to the individual school districts to determine what they want to spend to educate the students in their school district. And then the legislature is obligated to figure out how they're going to pay for it with a statewide education property tax.
Mhm.
This foundation formula goes the other way, and 36 states already use this. They say, okay, based on what it should cost to educate your students, you as a school district are going to get this base amount. and the administration has come up with, I think, $13,300 as a base amount to pay for the per student education, plus weights. And the weights are important because that gives you an added amount based on the needs of particular students, whether they're English language learners or they're coming from poverty. You're in a very sparse area where small schools are absolutely necessary just because they're geographically isolated. And our current weights that we use in a different way allows also for grade differentiation. And it allows more money for high school students than it does for elementary and less money for pre-K students. So anyway, the foundation formula uses that base plus the weights and says this is what you have to spend in your school budget. So it's a reversal of what the system is now. And the intent is to provide adequate funds for the education of students across the state. So that is a huge change.
You mentioned that the foundation approach. Is that what you just described?
Yes.
Much, yeah, absolutely.
It's a foundation formula, and it existed in Vermont before Brigham. The Brigham decision in 1997, which said this is inherently unfair. We are not delivering equal education opportunities to kids across the state because some communities can't raise enough money from the grand list. So legislature, you've got to figure out how to raise enough money to get out to the kids in other districts, but regardless of how wealthy their town is in terms of property value. So what that was found to be unconstitutional in 1997, and it was because the state, in its former foundation formula, did not adequately fund the foundation formula. It didn't kick in the money. And that was coming out of the general fund from income taxes. So instead, it established a statewide education property tax and said, this is how we're going to solve the problem. Before that, we didn't have a statewide education property tax. So that's what then provided more resources to the school districts and came up with these bizarre funding formulas that are so hard to understand. From a taxpayer standpoint, what am I going to pay based on the value of my property? What's the common level of appraisal? What's the coefficient of disbursement? I mean, things that make you say, I'm not smart enough to understand this, or this is unnecessarily complicated.
Yeah. So what is the intersection between what the governor and his administration is proposing with this 5-district approach and the educational financing piece of it? How do those two intersect? I mean, what about the 5-district approach would supposedly help address the cost equation?
Great question. So we were in meetings last week with the Secretary of Education, the Assistant Secretary, with the consultants they've hired to help them out of Colorado, and also the Commissioner of Taxes. And it was all about, all right, what are you doing? How is this going to save money? And how is it going to improve education, improve outcomes? And they really came at it from the equality of educational opportunities, not necessarily for cost being the driver. Now, the reason why a lot of us went to Montpelier this year was to figure out how to lower property taxes and how to get some taxpayer relief. What they came back with was this overhaul of education that may not in the end save any money. But they did say we can save $180 million from the current construction of our school system, and it's mostly through economies of scale. So by consolidating into 5 districts, you reduce your overhead in terms of the administration of the school district, from how many superintendents we have, how many business officers, that kind of stuff. So that's big. And then you look at what they think is the ideal class or ideal school size. So it's going to require consolidation of schools. They're recommending 600 students in a high school, 450 students in a middle school, 450 in an elementary school. They're talking about ideal student teacher ratios, 15 to 1 at the elementary level, 25 to 1 maybe at the high school level. So it's really configuring all these different things to get to economies of scale so that then you can realize savings. 80% of your education budget is personnel costs. And you're not going to realize any real savings unless you have fewer people, fewer adults in the classes. So there's so many pain points on this that we have to wade through. What does it mean? I mean, how many schools are we really going to end up with? How does that affect my school? How does it affect my school district? So it has to go through the education committee. It has to go through the tax committee on which I sit. It has to go through government operations because these are separate political entities. Each school district is its own municipality in essence.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
So you've got all these different things you have to consider, not to mention, how does it affect transportation? Because
that was going to be the next question I asked is,
right.
You suddenly be sending somebody to an elementary school that's 20 miles, 25 miles away from their home. And not only, what about those costs? How are we going to factor that in?
Well, the governor's proposed to actually kick in another $25 million towards transportation costs, but part of the proposal is then to take out universal school meals as one way to help pay for it. So that's right now it's about a $17.5 million program throughout the state. And many educators feel it's critical for the holistic education of their students. Others think, well, why are we paying for kids to have lunch that don't need the help? And so there's really strong schools of thought on both sides of that. So it's going to go through all these different committees. It's right now it's about hammering out the details. There is healthy skepticism that they're not using the right data. There's they meaning the Agency of Education. And even if you get to the point of having new school configurations where you can save $180 million a year, okay, how do you get from point A, where we are now, to point B? And so that's like a 3 or 4 year process at a minimum. So all in is probably going to take more than that. Just one example, if you create a regional high school, you got to build one. So that doesn't mean we've got it right away. It means you got to get it permitted, you got to get it approved, you got to build it. We've been at this with Woodstock Union High School and Middle School campus since 2016.
Sure.
In terms of looking at its deficiencies and trying to get voter approval. And that's in a holding pattern while all this stuff gets figured out.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Wow, what a quagmire.
This is huge. I mean, this is really big. What started as a simple, hey, we need to reduce how much we spend on education. It ain't that simple. And so this has really leapfrogged that commission on the future of public education I mentioned before. And they're now kind of wondering what their purpose is. And they can really be a sounding board for the governor and the legislature in figuring out, does this make sense? So that they have to be involved in the discussion because they're a good cross representation of stakeholders in the state.
And the education quality question is such an amorphous one that I don't even know how you begin to wrap your heads around that as lawmakers in terms of looking at quantifiable data about that as opposed to anecdotal material. It seems to me there's something you have to factor into it. If you're talking about, again, as we just discussed with transportation issues, a child traveling 20 to 25 miles to go to elementary school, that also means that parent's interaction with the school system, whether it's with a PTO or whatever, is diminished by that geographic. And that's an important component of an education as well as parental engagement.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that I think all of us like about the proposal in this way is to keep elementary schools as local as possible. because Johnny and Susie don't need to be on a bus for an hour and a half.
Yeah.
And so that makes total sense. But they're built in certain assumptions about how long it's acceptable to be on a bus. And I don't think those numbers work. Is it 75 minutes? Is that okay? It's like, I don't think so. Not for, a first grader or second grader.
No.
So those are some of the questions we got to ask. And then, yeah, it's big.
Yeah. Has anyone looked closely at what the systems look like in comparable states with significant rural communities to Vermont to see
Yeah.
how other states have, if they have, how they've dealt with this issue? Are there any role models out there that we might look at?
There's a lot of states. We met last week with some consultants who are experts in the field. One is Dr. Colby at the University of Vermont, but she has her own consulting firm as well. There's education consultants. I can't remember the name of the title, but they look at all 50 states, what's going on in those states as to what best practices are. There's a lot of data from those different places as to what their ideal school size, and what the Scott administration has been doing is trying to take some of those studies and to then overlay it into the context that is Vermont. To say, okay, this is where the best outcomes are being achieved in other states, based on a school size, based on the appropriate student-teacher ratio, all of those kinds of things. It's called evidence-based research on that. There's another thing that's called professional judgment criteria, where a number of experts get together and they say, well, really what we see, and these are experienced educators, is that you need to have this number of resources available for your students, not just based on this other seemingly arbitrary figure. So a combination of those two approaches really comes up with a number that you try to reconcile as to what that should look like for the state of Vermont. And that's what the consultants have come up with to say, here's what we're recommending based on all the research that we've done. And then it's a question of, does it really work well in the Vermont context? And we're trying to figure that out.
Well, we'll follow this circuitous route in more and more detail as things gel policy-wise. How do all these threads wind up getting woven together?
So here we are 4 weeks into the legislative session, and it should be 18 weeks. And we're very mindful that in order for us to do our work, we need to complete most of this by March 14th or March 21st. So that leaves from now six weeks in order to answer a lot of questions that are still out there, because we've got this thing called crossover that we have to pass it over to the other body. And so most of this work is being done in the House, and we're going to be meeting all the time on these issues. So some of the other ideas that have come up that are worthwhile on other unrelated issues, we just can't take up. Like this is dominating it. So we have to work together, both the House and Senate, which we're doing. We have to work as the committees within each body. We're doing that too, a lot of joint meetings. And the caucuses, at this point, there's no Democrat versus Republican in terms of the views on this. It's all, what is this? And we know we have to work together to come up with a solution, but there's not a party position on this. It's mostly trying to figure out what taxpayers can afford, what's the best education system for our students. That's pretty unified.
One more question, and then we'll wrap up relative to the issue you just brought about what taxpayers can afford. Some of the discussions I've had with some of your fellow legislators, particularly Senator Becca White from Hartford, have revolved around the question of what we expect out-of-state homeowners, second homeowners and out-of-state homeowners to contribute to educational expenses in Vermont. And there's a lot of feeling, there's a lot of sentiment among the general public that out-of-state homeowners, second homeowners, don't pay their fair share for what are essentially luxury properties for them. Is that part of the discussions that are going on as well? I mean, some people would call them luxury properties. Let's put it that way.
Yeah. I think there's a real robust discussion about how we're going to raise the money to fund this foundation formula, and that's a whole different side of the equation.
Yeah,
And it can be argued that people that have second homes or people that have other properties in which they don't have kids in the school system shouldn't be contributing as much because they're not contributing to the expense. All right, so that's an issue. Second homeowners really contribute a lot to the economy in terms of, what do they buy when they're here? What do they pay in taxes? What do they pay for services? So they're doing a lot there. So I don't want to denigrate the second homeowners because they're important parts to our economy, especially in a tourism-driven place like Woodstock.
sure, exactly.
But it should be an equal rate, at least, between on residential properties, whether they're primary or secondary homes. We're looking at what the system is for homestead exemptions or homestead taxpayer exemptions. There's a concept in Boston about, you only pay 35% of the average value of a single family home, or that's what is exempted from your property tax bill. So we're looking at in our committee probably 5 or 6 different potential scenarios as to how to fund this, fund education going forward. And that's a whole different aspect of the solution to it. But right now we only have 2 categories: homestead and non-homestead. And it creates some perverse activities where somebody may transfer their homestead into an LLC and not call it a homestead anymore. And where they have a property that is a higher tax rate for homestead. So we want to get away from those kind of perverse incentives and make sure that people are being taxed fairly. And so I think that's what we're driving towards. Absolutely.
Well, Charlie, as always, I thank you for being with us today. And this is clearly the top priority for the legislature this term, and it'll clearly be a top priority for us here on Legislative Update in the weeks ahead.
Fantastic.
Again, thanks, and we'll look forward to seeing you next week.
Likewise. Thank you, Tom.
All right, that's it for this edition of Legislative Update. My name is Tom Ayres, a senior staff writer for the Vermont Standard newspaper, and this program is co-produced in collaboration with our friends at Akimo Valley TV. Until next week, thank you.